Welcome to our 19th podcast. Today we'll be talking about active listening, helping everyone understand what that means and why it's so important for your change initiatives. Also, what's the one thing you can do now to be a more active listener? Keep active listening to find out. Pun intended. Welcome to Harmonious Workplaces, a podcast about corporate culture, organizational change management, and workplace behavior. Harmonious Workplaces was started by independent consultants Rich Cruz, Ben Kleinman, and Cheryl Volpe to explore, challenge, and build on various organizational culture and change management concepts. It's a blend of theory and practice based on their personal and professional experiences working with companies of all sizes across various industries. If you own a business, lead a team, want new ideas about the corporate environment, or just want to listen to a group of consultants talking about how to make work more enjoyable, we invite you to sit back, relax, and dive in with us to Harmonious Workplaces. Hello, Harmonious Workplaces listeners. As always, we're glad to have you today. My name is Rich Cruz, and I'm joined by my colleague Cheryl Volpe. Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, Rich. Hi, everyone.
And Ben Kleinman.
Hi. It's going to be that kind of show, isn't it?
It might be.
Already started.
Already started. So we are here today to talk about listening. So as we've talked about leadership and some of the behaviors of good leaders and bad leaders and all of that, we thought that we would talk about communication and specifically on the listening side, right? So active listening, it's not new. It's been around since, when was it? Who put those in?
1957.
1957?
Yeah, that surprised me so much because I'm guessing like you two, it seems like it's one of those things that's just quote unquote new. That's a relatively new fad in corporate culture, in the corporate world. People come in and say, oh, we need to be better listeners, and they're training their managers and their C-suite to be better listeners. And no, this has been around for 1 billion years.
Yeah. And I think it started, if I'm not mistaken, it started in kind of the counseling space before it hit the business space, right? It's taken a lot of different forms, and like you said, like lately, it's been showing up in the literature more and more. I think that the 2 articles that I was researching in prep for this were in 2022, so it's still relevant to be talking about active listening.
Yeah, it won't ever go out of. I mean, it's still so important. Whether you're talking about a interpersonal relationship in your personal life, or whether you're talking about a relationship with colleagues at work. It's a great skill to have, and something that most of us will continue to strive to get better at.
For sure.
Yeah. Right. And think of all miscommunications and all of those relationships that are just a simple matter of missing that word or that inflection, or just misinterpreting what is being said and not ever going back to double check on that.
Yeah. Right.
So before we dive too far in, Rich, do you want to, maybe we do a little bit of a definition, and we sort of said it's been around for a while, but just so that we level set for everyone, maybe do a little bit of a definition and describe what we're talking about when we say active listening, and then maybe describe how it works, and we can go from there.
Sure. Yep. Sounds great. Yeah. So the goal of active listening is to eliminate misunderstandings and to communicate more effectively, right? And so it's listening with intent. There was a different word that was used back in the 50s, but today we talk about intentional listening, right? And it's really listening rather than responding. Am I getting that right? Does that jive with the 2 of you? Great.
Right.
Yeah, so it's really showing that you're comprehending what somebody is saying, retaining the information, and responding back through paraphrasing what they said. Then asking some clarifying questions, and then summarizing what the speaker said.
Right. And there's a cognitive process in there, because you cannot be thinking about what you are going to say next. Then you're not really listening. Right.
Right.
And that is sort of the skill part of developing what this really means. You really have to listen first before you can respond. And that can be hard for leaders. That can be hard for people that have to get a job done and lead a project or make decisions. That can be hard when, especially under a time crunch or when there's a stressful situation happening.
Right.
So that's the real skill of active listening, is to call that patience, that slowing down, and that really cognitive comprehension of what the person who is talking to you is saying.
Yeah. I know sometimes, speaking of that, trying to understand and comprehend that, like you just said, Cheryl, I kind of struggle with that sometimes when I'm talking with people, and I have an idea in my head from what they said, and I want to get that idea out, so like I've noticed that those leaders that I've worked with who have been visionaries, especially, right? They've got this vision. This is what they have in their head, and they want to make this thing concrete. Whatever you just said, they caught that much of it, and they want to get their idea out there,
And this was one of the most amazing things with Zoom when we had to adjust to being at home during the pandemic, and that raise your hand function. I know myself that I very often would not use it, and I would get so excited. I remember many times cutting off my colleagues just because I didn't think I was going to get a chance to say the thing I had to say before the conversation rolled on. And here I would be not using the hand function. And then I realized, everyone else is using the radio.
Yeah.
I should pay attention to this. Yes, Ben.
Do you think it makes a difference based on the corporate culture? So, for example, there are some families where it's very common for people to talk to each other by talking over each other. And that's just the way they communicate. They expect that sort of really participatory, invigorated kind of conversation. And then there are other families where it's expected that there's a much more quiet approach and a much more sober tone. And you're expected to listen and talk and not be as enthusiastic, emotionally emotive, if that makes sense. Do you think that resonates in the corporate world as well, where depending on the culture, it may be that if you don't do that and you don't jump in and you don't speak over your colleague in a respectful kind of way, that people will think you're not engaged, you're not participating, you've checked out. Whereas in other cultures, that might be like, whoa, too much.
Sure.
Too much.
Well, this idea, to your very point of the talking stick, right? I think this is actually a new introduction into corporate culture where it is almost the same thing as raising your hand in a Zoom, but it's the person who has whether it's a real thing or just a concept, but the person with the talking stick cannot be interrupted. And I have seen families use a symbolic talking stick. But then if it's a brainstorming session or a debate at the family table, then that over talking will happen. And it's a natural part of that style of communication. But it's a great point, Ben, the culture of a company. I know that some cultures are comfortable with complete quiet for an extended period of time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but I love that you're going there with brainstorming sessions where you almost want that additive kind of participation, and some of that, like you say, frenetic or kinetic energy is so necessary for good brainstorming to really get these ideas to come out. And it's so important. At least I found it to be really helpful when people vocalize their ideas and say stuff or put it on a sticky and really make it very clear that they're thinking these things and getting it out into that sort of public consciousness. And then people can riff off of that. And later on, you come back and you take a little bit more of a measured approach, whittling things down, trying to see how things fit together. But sometimes it's necessary to have a little bit of that engineered chaos to where you come in and you get that. And we've talked about that on other shows before too, where sometimes it's helpful to have a little bit of stress, a little bit of chaos to get people moving a little bit more than they would otherwise. but maybe there's something about being thoughtful there.
Yeah, in our show notes here, I think the Stephen Covey quote of
I love Stephen Covey.
Seek first to understand, and then to be understood. Right, having that empathetic kind of approach to putting somebody else's needs before you, in that culture, goes a long way to facilitating that understanding on both ends.
Yeah, it's all about making it about the other person first and not you, not your ideas. And so I do that too, Rich, where you were saying before you have these great ideas, and Charlie, you were saying you have these things you need to say. And, sometimes I'll have to be scribbling down, and in part I'm taking notes about what other people are saying. And in part I'm just jotting down all these things that I need to say to respond or react or build on what other people are talking about. Cause otherwise I'll forget them. I mean, I got brain cells.
That much brain.
But yeah, it's important to recognize that within yourself too. Like, I know that about myself, and part of that is just recognizing that and using that to sort of help you get better at that active listening, help you be a better listener. Sorry, go ahead.
Just to your point, really quick, Ben, is that, instead of writing down what you don't want to forget, I suppose another layer of active listening would be, instead, you would be writing down what you're listening to. And then you would have that stuff written down. Right. Which I have never done. I notes for my own purpose, but this idea of taking them, and I shouldn't say never. I mean, obviously when there's a very important or urgent kind of conversation, I will write things down that someone has to explain more or hear back,
Sure.
But it works both ways with the Post-it notes, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. One thing that we've...
go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say there's a nonverbal component that we haven't really talked a lot about. So maybe that's something we come back to, Rich. I think you're about to go into a break, but I don't want to jump your thunder.
That's what I was going to say. To talk about some of the kind of the nuts and bolts of how we can be active listeners, right? And some of those tools and techniques, when we talk about that when we come back from the break. So see you in just a little bit.
For Fortune 100 companies and small businesses alike, Harborside Strategy helps design and implement customized precision change management initiatives. From new organizational structures to new processes to new systems, we help you clarify the reason and urgency around your change in language that will resonate across your organization. With that clarity and a common purpose, we use the power of stories and blended communication methods to reinforce your goals and keep everyone focused and aligned. All of it tailored to your people, your organization, your needs. Contact Principal Ben Kleinman today to learn more at www.harborsidestrategy.com. Again, that is www.harborsidestrategy.com.
And we're back. So we've been talking about active listening and what is it, right? But we started to dive into some of the methods that we can use to be active listeners, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. Where do we leave off?
Well, just to do a quick recap. Sorry, Cheryl. Quick recap. Active listening is really about being a participant in a conversation and reflecting back what someone has said, being involved in an intentional way, and listening to someone, recognizing their thoughts, repeating back, asking clarifying questions, summarizing. And after you feel like you've gotten their point of view correctly intaken and understood, only at that point then do you share your own thoughts or build your own ideas on top of that. And we've talked a little bit about how some of that is cultural and appropriate for some situations, and in other situations maybe you want a little bit of that more constructive kind of challenging and building on where you don't have that active listening as much. And so we've kind of built on that. And the one thing we were going to come to is sort of like you said, how do you do some of that? What are the verbal cues? What are the nonverbal cues? What are things that you can do to be a better active listener? Those kinds of things. So now we've got that nicely bowed. Cheryl.
Well done. Now, Rich, I think you had the stick next.
Oh, I have the stick. We should have had a talking stick or a conch shell. What was that? What book was that had the conch shell? Was that Lord of the Flies?
Lord of the Flies?
Wasn't it? I don't know. Somebody has a conch shell.
It makes me think of Robert's Rules of Order, where whoever has the gavel is able to speak.
Right.
Dang.
Right.
Dang.
I'll hold the harmonica in a can. Now I have the power to talk.
Harmonica can? Wait a minute.
A can. I'll talk about that later. Anyway, it's the only artifact I had on my desk at the time. But okay, so some of the tools and techniques for listening here, and I do want to say that some recent research, 2022 annual reviews said that the elements of observable listener behavior, right? Again, the nonverbal cues of showing that you understand somebody, nodding, making eye contact, writing down notes. Some of these nonverbal cues are super important. The behavior that you're doing that paraphrasing and asking those clarifying questions, right? And that the speaker is demonstrating that they can see that you are that the listener is engaged, right? So those three components are very important and have been important since the 50s, right? Those same three things have been there. So I know one of the things that, well, you had mentioned in some of the, like, these ideation sessions, these brainstorming sessions, some things that have worked for me is when I have a whiteboard, even virtually, now you have whiteboards, right? Where you write down, there's no wrong answer. You're writing down what everybody's ideas are, what their thoughts and feelings are, just laying it all out there, gathering all that data. I think that's been an important part of the active listening toolkit, that I've employed. Anything resonate with you on that?
Sure. And in those moments, there are no bad ideas. That's the whole brainstorming underlying premise, in that you are permitted to just say whatever is coming to mind with those whiteboards and those ideation sessions. And part of the active listening by everyone else is no criticism, no judgment, no pushing off the table, no negativity. Right?
Yeah. And I like the idea. Oh, sorry, Rich, go ahead.
I was just saying that there's that kind of empathetic approach to it, where
Right. And I like the idea, which I've seen work really well, of people, building on that idea, Charlotte, of no bad ideas, that they can ask clarifying questions, but they can't question the idea itself. They can't say, why would you ever think of that? That is dumb. But they can say, well, tell me more about that. I never would have thought of that. Why would you think that a blue button would be better than a red button? Help me understand that. And so a lot of those kinds of sort of clarifying questions, or help me understand kind of questions, can help elucidate that and be more of that helpful building on, as opposed to the no, thank you, I don't want to engage.
Right. And tone and trust is important there, right? If you say to someone, help me understand that, in a way that makes them feel like you think that they are judging you, then that conversation will come to a halt, right?
Yeah.
Help me understand how you could be crazy enough to think that. Well, no, that's not what we're doing here.
That's not the right way of doing it.
Right.
No, but you could say the exact same thing with almost the same exact words and have it not feel that way. You could be, help me understand. That is a crazy idea. I love it. I never would have thought of that. You must be absolutely just like, woo! But help me understand. How'd you get there? Right. And so I've just called you crazy as bat poop, but in a way that's probably not as offensive.
Yeah, I felt really special just now.
Until you called me guano.
Yeah, I mean, get the science right. It's not poop, Ben. It could be.
But
Right.
what you're talking about here, actually, it works in coaching. Those clarifying questions that coaches ask, right? That's a very important technique. And then in these peer groups that have, these mastermind groups or peer groups, or I mean, there's like even several franchises, that have come up, like the Alternative Board and some of the other ones escape me, but where somebody has a problem, they bring a problem to the group, and then there are just these clarifying questions. You're not allowed to give a solution. You're only allowed to ask questions and help to facilitate them.
Right.
So
no solution.
So there's no solutioning. They're coming up with the answers themselves. So it's all about listening. It's all about listening, and then giving them feedback through something to think about, so they can connect the dots.
And Cheryl, I go back to something you were saying earlier, where it can be really hard for a leader to bring his or her people along in a way that allows them to sort of get to the answer themselves, especially when you have so little time or so little budget or just such a compressed agenda and schedule, and you just need to get stuff done. The better leaders have figured out a good way to balance that, or a good way to get people to where they need to be, to understand things internally, to then be able to act on that without it taking days, weeks, months, years, that kind of thing. Whatever your time scale is, it's
Absolutely.
almost an art form.
Traditional part of the leadership role is to be the fixer, the problem solver, the solution-oriented driver, right? So
right.
The active listening counterbalances that with let your team get to their own conclusions, support them, and that's the coaching. To your point, Rich, there's a coaching element to the leadership toolbox.
Absolutely.
Right? And I feel like that's new in our cultures, at least since the 50s, and new since the 2000s, where you do have to let your team shine and feel that agency, self-efficacy, all of those things that your team can only get to through solving things and having their personal achievements. And some people get really frustrated when you're trying to fix something right away. Look, I didn't come to you to fix it. I need your help. Just listen.
I get that all the time. Yeah. Where people, where it's like, I don't want you to fix this right now. I need you to hear me.
Yeah.
Right.
And I feel like I have to relearn that lesson so many times. You'd think I would have learned it by now, but that's a whole different story. But, I'm wondering, is there something cultural about this, at least in the United States, where throughout the 40s and early 50s, it was sort of that father knows best kind of thing. And then around the mid 50s, late 50s, you have this theory coming out, active listening and participatory kind of conversation. And then all of a sudden, now it's this whole shift.
Yeah. I think that is deeply connected to why industrial organizational psychology is gaining more momentum and people are understanding more what that means, because it puts emphasis on that authentic person showing up to work to do their best. Whereas if you want to go back generations, that idea that you showed up, you did your job, and there wasn't necessarily a two-way conversation going on there with how you felt about it. Right?
Yeah. And the leader just said, we're going to do this. We're going to get it done. And it's my decision, and I'm the one on the hook to making this happen. And so we're going to do it my way or the highway. And now I think you've sort of seen over the last several decades that in many cases it's easier to work with your team on board as opposed to dragging your team by force.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, IO psychology started with the industrial side of psychology, which is like how tasks got done, and efficiencies, right? Yeah. So what did it take to do this task, and how could you get it done faster, cheaper, better? And the organizational side, which deals more with how people work together, innovation, group dynamics, and motivation, right? Those elements that we probably associate more with what we talk about in change management and organizational development, right? How we work together. That stuff came later on, right? So you're right. Like, culturally, there were shifts later in the 20th century. Post. I'm trying to find those dates, but maybe we'll come back to that on the next episode. But
sure, we can just put it in the show notes.
Yeah, but it was there were definitely some cultural shifts. But there's also from a east-west type of that's very general. But so you have these individualistic cultures, which are the United States and a lot of Europe, and where it is really focused on the individual and their achievements, right, and how they do things at work, right, and then there's the collectivist, right, where this is how we work together as a group, and that's where a lot of the talking stick stuff happens, right? Really, where silence for a long time is uncomfortable for an individualist, but not so much for a collectivist. And oftentimes, where there is this: how do we work together to make this thing happen, rather than how do I kind of, for lack of a better word, become the hero in this in the story,
Mm-hmm. And it's almost an expectation too that in non-Western cultures, maybe there's a sense that one subordinates oneself for the greater good.
Sure.
And at least in many of the companies I've worked in the US and in Europe, that is very much not an expected part of the culture, either the corporate culture or the societal culture. It's very much about that hero journey.
Yeah.
And people would take pride in working 80 hours a week to get a project done. And it's like all these challenges they had to overcome by themselves to just power through it. And we've talked on our show about how that can be so devastating.
Sure.
And so unhealthy.
Sure.
Well, there's a whole nother perspective also on the hero's journey where, the hero is set back with a number of tremendous challenges, and they try to overcome the challenges. They fail, and then they finally just take the hardest path there is. They have success on that path. Wisdom begins to take hold, and then what happens? They go back to the community where they started to do good or to impact the larger whole.
The larger whole, yeah.
Right, and I realized that isn't necessarily a parallel to what happens to us at work, but the hero's journey does have a very set classical place in our culture as that whole cycle kind of thing.
Yeah. Where the individual's achievement almost is a kind of it's the savior, but it helps the whole community, right? I remember at the end of The Hobbit, the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, where the whole last part of the book is all the aftermath of what happened because of the benefit that the quests brought. So you see that in the literature all over the place, but that's culturally, I guess that's ingrained in us. We see that a lot.
Right. And at work, that could be the leadership journey. You go through all of that learning and wisdom and you gather, and then you go to a position where you are responsible for the collective and you show them how to shine individually instead of you have now gained that wisdom to understand that you can't do it without the team and let them shine on their own. I realize we've gotten down a little bit of a rabbit hole that could be a whole nother episode.
That's probably right.
I was just going to say, I have been so impressed listening to our journey here on this one show where we've talked about all sorts of stuff from harmonica in a can to Eastern versus Western cultures to The Hobbit and how that is a triumph of leadership journeys. It's just been, and not to say anything about the 1950s in the United States and, all that sort of stuff.
And Ben,
wow,
what you're demonstrating is active listening. I don't think
it's almost awe. I'm almost in awe that we have charted this course in 20, 30 minutes. And I do have to say, just for those keeping track at home, we were about 22, 23 minutes in before Rich threw in the first acronym.
There you go.
I saw it.
IO psychology. Can you believe that?
Well,
Rich, we're breaking you.
And you can't escape it because I was also going to mention this, and I'm going to say this before we take our second break, that perceived organizational support, or POS, which means a whole different thing when I was a teenager and I had a really bad car, right?
Point of service, of course.
Oh, point of service or piece of...
Or point of sale.
Anyway, but that plays a huge role in employee engagement and job satisfaction, right? And that's when people feel that they've been listened to, that they have the feedback, that they have those, that leadership actually cares. They tend to go above and beyond, exhibit those, organizational citizenship behaviors, OCBs. Haha, I got 2 in there.
Two in like a minute and a half? Holy cow, right. You're making up for lost time.
That's making up. Yeah, that's right. So, use POS for OCBs. There you go. So, So I mean, it just goes to say that, facilitating the conversation and the communication, just it's a great leadership practice that seems to be supported by the research. So, all right, when we come back after this last break, we're going to try to distill this down to one thing you can do to be a more active listener. We'll be right back.
Are you struggling with high employee turnover, low morale, or poor communication within your team? Do you find it challenging to foster collaboration and trust among your employees? Do you have resistance to some of the recent changes you've made in your business? You're not alone. According to sources such as Forbes and the Society for Human Resources Management, many business owners face these same challenges. They know that success comes from a strong workplace culture, but they don't always know where to start. If this sounds like you, it's time to take action. Our experienced consultants stand ready to work with you to develop customized solutions. Don't wait any longer. Take our quick culture scorecard today and discover where you can improve. Work Balance Consulting, where workplace culture meets success. Visit our website at www.workbalanceconsulting.com/scorecard and start your journey toward a better workplace today. Again, visit www.workbalanceconsulting.com/scorecard.
And we're back. All right. Well, so we've we've talked a lot about a lot of things regarding active listening. Anybody want to give a little recap of what we've talked about? Because it's pretty dense.
We're all looking at each other like,
oh, boy,
deer in the headlights.
That's a tall order.
Well, let me just throw out one or two ideas. What's that, Cheryl?
I have to check all the notes I took.
Right. Check all the notes. Yeah. We talked about how active listening is really about listening with intent of putting the other person and his or her ideas first and not reacting or responding until you fully understood that person's perspective, and how it's very important to reflect back what that person has said, make sure that you're asking clarifying questions and summarizing to understand fully what that person has said so that you minimize miscommunications. There's a verbal component, obviously. There's also a nonverbal component where you show that you're very much in the moment. You're participating in that conversation. You're not sitting there just sort of, yeah, I'm listening, but, oh, there's a score of the game update. Yeah, interesting. I'm sorry, what? And so it's that kind of very, very intentional participating. We talked, and I have to go back to Stephen Covey. Love his perspectives and so much of what he has written about, but that seek first to understand, then to be understood really encapsulates active listening for me in a way that makes sense for me. We've talked about all sorts of other stuff, how this sort of was brought about in the late 1950s, 1957, and how it's kind of taken on a whole life of its own within not just the social fabric of America, or at least the Western ideas, but also corporate culture, how cultural expectations differ East versus West, and how sometimes it's appropriate not to have active listening in terms of maybe brainstorming sessions or ideation sessions where you want some of those clarifying questions maybe, but you don't necessarily want a lot of that thoughtful, crafted sort of very deep understanding. You just want to get stuff out, and then you come back and you distill and hone it down. We've also talked about harmonicas and cans. And Rich, you just before our last break, you left us with about 17 different acronyms. And so maybe we unpack those a little bit, and then we get to that one thing that people can do to become better active listeners.
Well, I'll just tell you what those acronyms are. I mean, the one is IO Psychology, Industrial Organizational Psychology, where we did say that the industrial part of it really is more the task-focused, like the nuts and bolts of the work that needs to be done.
Economic.
So, right, the economic element, right? And then the organizational side, which would be more of the, how we work together, motivation, kind of the other characteristics that make work what it is. I talked, the other acronym was Perceived Organizational Support, POS, and then that is, one of those that through, I should say, active listening as a leadership component, facilitating organizational citizenship behaviors, OCBs. So there we go.
There you go. Citizenship, you got that in there too.
Yeah.
Excellent. That comes almost back to that community concept too.
It does, yeah. Right, for sure. So one thing that we can do to be a more active listener, go.
Can you please repeat the question? No.
Yeah, right. Well,
I'm sorry,
we kind of just
say?
did it in a way, right? I mean, part of those things is be quiet, right? I mean, that's have that that empathetic and openness.
Right.
I think that's one element.
Can you say that
you guys
in a different way? That's one of my favorite questions, because if I don't understand something, I will say, are there other words that you could use that could help me understand that a little bit better, instead of me just guessing at what that means? And I have to consciously think to ask that question before I start guessing and trying to pull at the problem and fix it. Can you say that another way so I can understand that better? It's one of my favorite things to do. And that's just, you just have to remember to do that.
That is beautiful.
When you're confronted with something that you don't exactly understand.
Right.
As someone says it too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's wonderfully eloquent. I mean, like, can you say that in another way to clarify that? I'm putting that in my toolkit for sure. Thanks.
What were you going to say before I cut you off?
Oh, I was just going to say, since you both have kids, I don't know if you've ever heard of this notion of quiet coyote, but apparently a lot of teachers nowadays will get out the quiet coyote when they want their classroom to simmer down and shut up. And so it's a way of getting the kids to sort of, and so I get that a lot at home now. I get the quiet coyote, Dad. And, you know,
different than this.
That is totally different from heavy metal rock and roll. Yes. Two very different things, Joe.
Oh.
What I was going to say, though, is it reminds me a little bit of mindfulness, and where you're very much in the moment and you're not doing 75,000 different things. You're intentionally sitting with a person or a group of people, and you're just being in that moment, and you're being in conversation with them, and almost relinquishing everything else or releasing everything else for a short bit of time to be with that person and that person's thoughts. And then you can re-engage.
Yeah.
So important. Just that dedicated focus. No distraction.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've talked about earlier on, I think in several episodes, we've talked about mindfulness to some extent, you know, being present in what's happening and accepting that as what's happening right now, right? As opposed to trying to, I mean, even though we talk a lot about change, right, and trying to change things, just being present and understanding what is actually happening right now, so we can facilitate that change going forward. You know, that makes a lot of sense to be mindful. Great. Anything else we want to add before we wrap up this week's episode?
It's not exactly one thing, but I think we did a good job. Cheryl, go ahead. Sorry.
I just have to bring up my favorite XKCD Dick Person comic joke. And I think that part of what I do when I'm filling in the blanks about what someone is saying to me sometimes, and my son always laughs about this. You're doing it again, Mom. So here's the whole setup. It's two people talking, and the one says, it's a group of people, I'm sorry, and there's a presenter, and the presenter says, like most of you, I have a problem with projection. That's the whole thing. And that is something to remember when you're projecting what you think someone is saying onto them. Ask them to clarify me.
I'm going to have to make... Is there a cartoon of that already?
There is.
There is. Oh, okay. All right. I was like, man, that would be great.
Yeah, I wish there was.
Yeah.
Then it would be mine.
Yeah, right. I don't want to plagiarize that one. That's beautiful. Great. Well, we hope that our listeners have gained some insight into active listening, some tools and techniques that you can use and employ today. We will be resuming our podcast again next week, and with another topic on the stuff that we talk about work, making a more harmonious workplace through change management, organizational development, IO psychology, HR, and all the other things that make us work at work. So, and with that, everybody's taking a sip of there's mine. Right on. Okay.
Fun conversation today, everyone. Thanks.
Fantastic. We'll see you all later.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Harmonious Workplaces. You can find Harmonious Workplaces on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and other streaming platforms. We'd love any feedback on whatever channel you find us on. Please rate, like, and share our podcast with your network, and remember to add Harmonious Workplaces to your list of favorites to get notified about each new episode. To contact Rich or Cheryl, please visit www.workbalanceconsulting.com. To connect with Ben, find him on LinkedIn or visit at www.harborsidestrategy.com.